Good afternoon from Hove. I'm Father Alexander. I'd just like to talk to you a bit about King Solomon. In fact, let's finish off King Solomon's reign in this 102nd step in our walking tour through the Bible. Now, we get to chapter 10 of First Book of the Kings. We're told what a wonderful ruler Solomon is, that the Queen of Sheba comes all the way from Sheba, which is somewhere at the south of the Arabian Peninsula, we think, somewhere like Yemen, in order to question him and to see what Solomon is really like. And she is left breathless, we are told. We're also told that he has a fleet that goes off and comes back laden with gold and even baboons and monkeys. This fleet sails out with Hiram, the king of Tyre's fleet. So Solomon is a great trader. He's trading with people down the Red Sea, he's trading with people in the Mediterranean. And possibly the key to all this prosperity is his alliance with the king of Tyre, with the Phoenicians, who were the world's greatest traders at that time. Anyway, it's clear, isn't it, from reading the Bible, that Solomon is the most glorious king. And even in the time of Jesus, many years later, 700 years later, people were still talking about Solomon as the man who put Israel on the map, the greatest king they'd ever had from the terms of worldly glory. And Jesus says, not even Solomon in all his glory was arrayed as one of these. In other words, Jesus invokes Solomon as that sort of um, international gold standard of glory, if you like. But then, of course, chapter 11, we hear about what goes wrong. Now, what does go wrong? Because it's not really clear, because while it's giving a historical account of all Solomon's achievements, it gives a theological account of his decline. Well, various enemies arise, and including internal enemies. He's got trouble with the Edomites, he's got trouble with the Ammonites, and he's got trouble inside the kingdom with a man called Jeroboam, son of Nebat, whom he tries to have killed and who flees to Egypt. And Jeroboam, son of Nebat, we'll be hearing more of him later. But the real problem, according to the writer of the second book of the Kings, first book of the Kings, is Solomon's heart goes after strange, that is to say, foreign gods. And how does this happen? It's because of the wives. He has 1,000 wives, 700 of royal rank, and 300 concubines. Now, most of these ladies he probably never met. They were sort of sent to him as tributes, and he sort of stored them away in his harem, and he hardly ever saw them. But the truth of the matter is, he allows them to worship their own gods, or doesn't bother to stop them worshipping their own gods. This passage in the Bible, chapter 11, was very much to the fore in Stuart England. James the Sixth and First had a wife called Anne of Denmark. Anne of Denmark was originally a Protestant from Denmark who became a Catholic. And this was kept quiet, of course, but she had the Mass celebrated for her in her private apartments and so on. She retained a priest around her. This was considered rather a bad thing. In fact, it was considered as bad as the worship of Moloch, which is condemned here, and the worship of Astarte. In other words, James VI and First didn't clamp down on this worship of a foreign god in his midst, i.e. Catholicism. And then, of course, if you thought that was bad, it got worse. Charles I married Henrietta Maria, who was French, and Henrietta Maria came to England with a retinue of Catholics, and in this retinue were several priests. And therefore, the Mass was more or less openly celebrated in London, thanks to the Queen, because wherever the Queen went, the Mass went with her. And of course, it meant that high ranking English people had access to the Queen's court and had access to the Mass, and many of them maybe were converted. They were seen as a Trojan horse. And indeed, this was the passage they turned to. They said that just as Solomon tolerated the religious ways of his foreign wives, so Charles I is tolerating the strange gods of Henrietta Maria, and he has introduced this into England, into the land of Israel, if you like, and therefore he will lose the throne as a result. And so it came to pass. In fact, it had been written into the marriage treaty of Charles I that Henrietta Maria was allowed to have a priest with her. So, and Charles I actually, even though he had a popular reputation for being tolerant of Catholicism was anything but. But the whole point here is that God hates foreign gods, the false gods, the abominations they're called. The abomination of Milcom, the abomination of verses 7 chapter 11. These are abominations. They cannot be tolerated. One of the things that we see reading the Old Testament is that our Israelite brethren are deeply, deeply intolerant of any other God apart from the Lord their God, the God of Israel. And Solomon's real problem is that he promotes a very limited um, type of religious tolerance. The royal women are allowed to follow their own religions. This is considered absolutely awful, and for this reason, he will lose the throne. It goes a bit deeper than this, though, and I'd put it this way. Solomon starts off as a fine and upright young man, but as an old man, his heart was swayed by his wives. In other words, what is Solomon's sin? Solomon's sin is uxoriousness. Not a word you hear much. In other words, he pays too much attention to his wives. Does this sound familiar? Well, about the time when Solomon was sitting on his throne, somebody was writing a book, and the book they wrote was the story of Adam and Eve, which of course is the very first book of the Bible. And the story of Adam and Eve is about a man, the man, Adam, who breaks the law of God because of his wife. He is uxorious. She gives him the fruit to eat, and therefore he eats it, and he displeases God. John Milton, the great poet, takes us even further. Adam knows he's doing wrong. He knows that Eve will be killed because she's eaten the fruit. He cannot bear living without Eve, so he decides he prefers to die with Eve than live with God. That is uxoriousness gone mad, according to Milton, who incidentally was a rather uxorious man himself. So the sin of uxoriousness, paying too much attention to your wife, is a sort of strange sin by today's standards. I don't think anybody ever goes to confess it. It's basically saying the man has abdicated responsibility. He has given up the role that is proper to himself and allowed a whole load of other people to take over that role. King Solomon should have said to his wives, look here, you're not allowed to do this. But he was too tolerant, too kind, too patient. In the background, behind the sin of uxoriousness, is possibly the sin of lust. Now, he had 1,000 wives. Here we go. He had 700 wives of royal rank and 300 concubines. That's verse 3. These wives were purely status symbols. They were the original trophy wives. Somebody sent him a wife and he said, okay, thank you very much. You couldn't send the wife back. That would be an insult. Very much like in the Turkish Empire, many of the sultans were given wives by the people who wanted to flatter them and by foreign dignitaries and so on. So he's been given all these wives, he can't get rid of them. But it's not necessarily he had 1,000 wives because he was sex mad. It doesn't say King Solomon was sex mad, but it's quite, or a sex addict, as we'd say nowadays. Now, we've heard of modern political leaders who have a retinue of beautiful young women around them. And these foreign leaders possibly are these, so did I say foreign? These political leaders are not very good at leading because they're constantly distracted by the sins of the flesh. Is Solomon distracted by the sins of the flesh? I would say he probably is. St. Thomas Aquinas says, I'm not quite sure where, but he does say that if you fall prey to the sins of the flesh, you won't have good judgment because the sins of the flesh will warp your judgment. And clearly, Solomon should have clamped down on these strange gods, but his judgment is warped by the women around him. They hold, as it says, when Solomon grew old, his wives swayed his heart. Now, the heart is not just the seat of the emotions, it's a seat of judgment. That Solomon's judgment was warped by the women around him. He should not have fallen into that temptation. Some people say sexual sins are not particularly serious. They're wrong. Sexual sins quite often lead to absolute disaster. Um, the Trojan War was caused by sexual sin. It seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But in fact, these sort of sins do lead people to disaster. And so it proves with the kingdom of Israel. Solomon, a great governor, in the end, could not govern himself. Okay, we'll see what happens next episode. Bye.